you can send it to me, and perhaps what we could do, Christine, is if you are willing, you could do the translation.
Okay, April, so it's 7:04. So whenever you'd like to start and work through the PowerPoint slides, that's up to you.
We want to start recording.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ray.
And I'm going to record onto the computer and not the cloud. I'm not sure if I'm logged into the cloud or how it
Okay,
works.
yeah, just do what you know. All right. Thank you. Thanks. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for attending this important webinar. Tonight we have the distinguished attorney, Steve Siegel, as well as one of our policy committee members, who are both going to discuss our proposed changes to the New York State private housing finance law.
Buenas noches a todos, bienvenidos. Esta noche vamos a tener como siempre al gran abogado Steven Siegel y a otra persona que es el miembro del comité de normas que nos va a actualizar sobre lo que está pasando en cuanto a las leyes.
As we go through the evening, you'll hear about various attempts that have been made to try to change the private housing finance law as well, and in those efforts to further regulate HDFCs in what we see as a negative manner.
Durante la noche van a ver qué es todo lo que ha estado pasando en cuanto a las leyes privadas de la vivienda y eso cómo afecta a los HDFC personalmente.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk in more broad terms tonight, and
vamos a hablar en términos más generales esta noche.
And I'm sure that we'll have future webinars where we'll dig a little deeper, and we solicit your comments also.
Y vamos a tener más de estos webinars en el futuro, donde vamos seguramente a pedir sus comentarios también.
And after this session, we will distribute a recording as well as a survey for you to give us your input.
Cuando terminemos esta noche, les vamos a entregar una grabación de lo de hoy y una encuesta para que escriban lo que piensan.
So before I go into the run of the evening, as well as some housekeeping issues.
Antes de que comencemos esta noche y las normas básicas para esta noche.
I just want to say that what we as the policy committee and as members of the HDFC coalition did was we decided that rather than being the coalition of no and objecting to what other people were proposing.
Entonces, como parte del comité de pólizas y del comité de los HDFCs, entonces, para saber qué es lo que la gente está proponiendo.
And that we would create our own amendment to the private housing finance law that would, as the slide says here, would help and not hurt HDFCs.
Dijimos que nosotros mismos íbamos a proveer las enmiendas para que estas leyes no hieran a las HDFC, sino que les ayuden.
And so we're going to go through our proposal, and
vamos a hablar de la propuesta tal y como está.
And just be assured that this is a draft. It's a pretty, a well-developed draft, but we do want your comments, and it will change over the course of time, but we would like to, on a timetable, submit it. And we already have some backing by legislators who said that they would, once we have it sorted out, they would help us get it introduced into New York State law.
Acuérdense que esto es solamente un borrador, pero ya tenemos legisladores trabajando en esto y cuando esté listo, esto pues ya se va a mandar al Estado para finalizar.
Okay. So Ray, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so unfortunately, we had a glitch with our interpretation. So Kika will be doing interpretation as we speak, and not in a separate room for Spanish speakers.
Entonces hoy tuvimos un pequeño problema con la parte técnica. No vamos a estar hablándoles en español en un salón separado, sino que lo vamos a hacer así como lo hemos estado haciendo.
And we ask that as we go along, if you have questions, we are not going to open the floor for questions, but at this point, but after the presentation, we will open the Q&A and we'll go through the questions in the Q&A. So if you submit your questions, you see at the bottom, there's a black bar and you can submit your questions as a Q&A in the Q&A box, and we'll go through the questions after the presentation.
Entonces las preguntas no las vamos a ir respondiendo a medida que seguimos esta noche, sino al final de la presentación. Si ven el botoncito abajo que dice Q&A, preguntas y respuestas, ahí pueden ir poniendo sus preguntas y al final de la noche se les responde.
And we will post this webinar, the recording of the webinar, and on the Community Board 9 page, as well as the HDFC Coalition's page. And when
Y
you
la
get,
grabación de esta noche se publicará en la página del HDFC, tanto como en el Community Board número 9.
and when you get the e-blast, which will include the survey, you'll have a link to both of those sites.
Y cuando reciban la encuesta, el IGLAS, ahí les van a dar los vínculos para ambas plataformas.
And so you'll be able to share it with your fellow shareholders and your neighbors alike.
Así lo podrán compartir con sus vecinos y sus accionistas socios.
Okay. So next slide. So I'm going to do a few thank yous. First, I want to thank Community Board 9 for letting us use their Zoom account to host these meetings.
Primero le quiero dar gracias a Community Board 9 por permitirnos usar su cuenta de Zoom para hacer estas reuniones.
And for being a big help in the background, helping us getting them organized.
Y por estar ayudándonos a organizarnos siempre.
I would also like to thank the members of the policy committee who've worked really hard to put together the 3 seminars that we have, and we're planning additional ones in the future. And I will and I'll also add, just if you have ideas for issues that you would like us to cover.
Y también entonces quiero agradecerles a todo el comité de normas y los que han ayudado a crear estos 3 webinars, aunque también vamos a tener más en el futuro. Vamos a recibir ideas.
You can give us your ideas, either put them in the chat tonight or respond to an email or send the HDFC Coalition an email.
Y las ideas que tengan las pueden ir anotando en el chat, aquí a la derecha, o también por email.
And we also want to give a huge thank you to everyone who donated to our GoFundMe Coalition Defense Fund.
Y les quiero dar gracias a todos los que donaron dinero al fondo de GoFund para la coalición.
As you can see, we've raised over $7,000. And as the slide says, we only spend the money on postage and mailings and on the cost of hiring an interpreter.
Entonces, como verán aquí, se ha recaudado ya más de $7,000, lo cual solo lo usamos en el correo y lo que se requiere para el correo y los servicios de traducción.
And Peter will give a detailed description of the money that has been spent so far, which will be included in the notification that you get after this meeting. He has a family issue tonight, so he's unable to join us.
Ok, Peter tuvo un problema familiar, por eso no puede estar acá con nosotros, pero después les va a explicar mejor en qué se ha gastado este dinero hasta ahora.
Okay, next slide, please. And here's our website, www.hdfccoalition.org.
Esa es nuestra página web.
And you can sign up for our mailing list where you'll get all of our e-blasts and all of our mailings that go out. And you can also sign up if you'd like to volunteer. Let us know that you would like to volunteer and what particular skills you might be able to lend to us, because we need all of the help that we can get.
Y también en la plataforma, en la página web, ahí pueden anotarse, registrarse para que les mandemos todos los emails de notificaciones y de todo, y también decirnos si les gustaría servir de voluntarios y qué tipo de habilidades o conocimientos tienen para ayudarnos.
Okay. Next slide. And if you'd like to read along, the proposal, the latest copy of the proposal is on our website, and you can download it, or you can read it online.
La última versión de la propuesta aparece en la página web, la pueden leer ahí o la pueden descargar a sus computadores.
Okay, next slide. I think I went over all of this. Next slide. Okay, so now please don't raise your hand during the webinar. We're not going to acknowledge raised hands, but if you have a question or you have a comment, and please try not to make it too lengthy, we will go through the questions at the end of the presentation. So please take notes and put your questions in the Q&A. If there's something really burning that you feel you've got to get out, you can put it in the chat and someone will be monitoring the chat, but please try not to inundate the chat. We're mainly focusing on the Q&A.
Recuerden que si suben la mano, la manita azul, no podemos responder las preguntas ahorita. Todo tiene que ser a través del Q&A y al final de la noche se responden sus preguntas o si tienen comentarios o lo que sea. Y por favor que no sean comentarios muy largos, lo mismo con las preguntas.
Okay, and so we're going to begin, and just to reiterate, you will get a copy of the recording in your email. If you registered, we have your email address. If you sign up for a mailing list, we will have your email address. You'll get a copy of the recording as well as our latest proposal.
Entonces van a recibir un email o si se registraron en la página web con la grabación de esta noche, si es que están en la lista de contactos de nuestras notificaciones.
Okay, next slide.
Okay.
And with that, and we're also sending a survey out. And John?
Thank you, April. So I guess this is the part of the webinar where we introduce attorney Steven Siegel, who has been extremely helpful in a number of fights that HDFC shareholders have fought and won over approximately the last 4 to 5 years.
Ahora vamos a presentarles a nuestro abogado Steven Siegel, que nos ha ayudado pues inmensamente durante los últimos 4 años.
And again, my name is John McBride, and I'm on the HDFC Coalition Policy Committee.
Y mi nombre de nuevo es John McBride y yo soy miembro de la coalición de Coalition Policy Committee.
If I can pause for a second, April, did you want to determine whether or not we need simultaneous Spanish translation, or do you just want to go forward as we are?
I have not seen any communication stating that we need it in the chat. I think if
we need to ask that in Spanish though, right?
she asked it, do you want to ask that again?
Yes, April.
Thank
Buenas noches. Si hay alguien esta noche en el seminario que necesite servicios de interpretación, les agradecemos si lo escriben en el chat. Ahora.
Gracias.
Okay. So I want to turn this over to Steve as quickly as possible. We did put some slides together just sort of to keep us on the high level points. And this is to a great degree Steve Siegel's presentation. And I think I could turn it over to him. Steve, can you see the slide?
Ahora con ustedes, Steven Siegel.
Are we doing translation?
Up or any, so I think we can go without doing it. Would you All right. Why don't you, Stephen, why don't you and John go ahead? Signy just signed on. I'm going to talk to her privately and see if we can straighten this out. Steve, go ahead.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I am Steve Siegel. I am an attorney. I've been helping the coalition for about three and a half years. And they're a great bunch of people. We've had some great successes. As April mentioned, we've been fighting battles at the city level, at the state level, and I don't want to be immodest, but we have won most of them. We have beaten back initiatives from Bill de Blasio's city and HPD that would effectively re-regulate HDFCs and take away the damp tax exemption if an HDFC did not agree to essentially draconian controls. And that was...
Buenas noches, mi nombre es Steven Siegel. Como les dije, yo he estado trabajando con ustedes hace tres años y medio con mucho éxito. Les he ayudado a nivel de la ciudad y a nivel estatal a lograr cosas en contra de lo que el alcalde de Blasio quería hacer para después desregular a los HDFCs y no permitirles la exención de impuestos.
Okay, and so back in 2017, the city attempted to basically hold a gun to the heads of HDFCs and said, if you don't accept this entirely new regulatory regime, you will lose your tax benefits.
Entonces, básicamente en el 2017 nos pusieron una pistola en la cabeza a los HDFCs diciendo que si no aceptaban estas reglas, estos métodos regulatorios, pues no les iba a ir bien.
That proposal was withdrawn.
Pero esa propuesta fue retirada.
After probably a year to a year and a half in which the HDFC coalition led the charge, had street protests outside City Hall, mobilized elected officials, and HPD withdrew the proposal.
Entonces, después de una lucha, como un año y medio después de manifestarse en frente a la alcaldía y todo, pues se retiró esta propuesta.
Meanwhile, the city proposed legislation at around the same time to re-regulate HDFCs at the state level and to change the law, this private housing finance law.
Luego la ciudad hizo algo para regular al HDFC, lo cual lo llevaría a un nivel estatal para cambiar todo esto.
And that proposed law back in 2017 and 2018 essentially would have said that HDFCs are subject to the perpetual control of the city of New York, essentially making them public housing.
Entonces esto en el 2017-2018 lo que decía básicamente es que el HDFC está absolutamente sujeto al control de la ciudad.
And one of the things that they said in the law, in the proposal.
Christine, I'm sorry, Steve, can you hang on one second? Christine, I just sent you a private message. Would you please call Signy immediately? And she was going to try to work out the interpretation room.
Okay.
And we'll just back up and interpret the part that we miss for the recording, okay? I sent you a number. Sorry, everybody.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Stephen. Would you mind speaking up just a bit, please?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So the city's legislative proposal to the state legislature in 2017 said, we're going to subject you to the perpetual control and regulation. And it also said, very tellingly, that if we don't do this, we're going to lose a lot of affordable housing. If we don't change the state law, we're going to lose affordable housing. Now, that was a very telling admission because that was an acknowledgement by the city that under the current state of the law, this private housing finance law, that HDFCs who are no longer subject to regulatory agreements could leave the program if they wanted to. Now, that's a big question. The law is not a model of clarity, and it really hasn't been tested very much. But our view of the law, and the city itself acknowledged it in this memorandum in support of its own legislation as to why the state legislature should subject HDFCs to perpetual control, is that after a regulatory agreement expires, if an HDFC wants to leave the program and become a private co-op, it can do so under existing law. Now, the HDFC Coalition's view has always been, we want HDFCs to remain in the program. What we don't want is a top-down legislative fiat that we lose all of our autonomy and we become permanent vassals of the city. That's what the city wanted to do. We, on the other hand, have an entirely different approach. We say most of us would like to remain as HDFCs, but you have to respect our autonomy under the law. And we should be able to engage in self-determination like any other co-op. And let me back up for a second. The private housing finance law has a variety of different programs for different subsidized co-ops. I'm sure most of you have heard of Mitchell-Lama. And there's other types of co-ops called Article 5 redevelopment companies. All of those other types of co-ops under the same statute, just different parts, have the ability to leave the program after a fixed number of years. And and some Mitchell-Lamas remain regulated with tax breaks, with mortgage subsidies. But if they don't want to, after spending 20 years in the program, they leave. It's up to the city to induce them to stay. And that's all we're asking for, is the same right that every other subsidized co-op in the state of New York has, but that the city, for some reason, has refused to give to HDFCs, even though the governing documents that HDFC signed quite clearly say, as I'm sure many of you know, that there's a fixed term for the regulation. For the older HDFCs, that was 10 years. Back in the 1990s, it was changed to 25. That meant that you couldn't leave the program without the permission of the commissioner of HPD. And it was written right there in black and white. The promises were made. HDFC shareholders bought into their buildings, made improvements, reasonably relied on these representations made by the city in a co-op offering plan, which, as you know, is a legal document that has binding force and effect. It's a set of promises, an offering plan is. And but guess what? At the end of it, all of a sudden, the city wants to say, no, 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 you're affordable housing forever. Okay, so that's one aspect to this, an important one, but let's put that aside for 1 minute. Another aspect of this, as you all know, you get a tax exemption from the city of New York. And it was originally granted in 1989, and it runs to 2029. It's commonly called the DAMP tax exemption, which stands for the Division of Alternative Management Programs, which was the part of HPD that originally created, which was presided over the tenant interim lease program, which gave rise to the HDFC program. So we now have a situation in which these 40-year tax exemptions are going to be up. If no one does anything, in 9 years, it will be over. Now, anyone who's entering into a mortgage now has to be worried that the lender is going to look at that and say, we don't know what the hell you're going to be assessed at for your taxes in just a few years into the mortgage. Can't even make a mortgage because it's too uncertain. We've had anecdotal evidence of that being the case. So it's vital that we focus on how to secure this tax abatement that's going to expire for hundreds and hundreds of buildings across the city of New York in 9 years. What we want, of course, is a permanent tax benefit. That is, logically, as long as we remain affordable as HDFCs, we need a tax benefit, of course. It seems so obvious. And so the HDFC Coalition looked at these different issues and said, can we fashion something that positively responds to these problems and issues and says, one, that HDFCs could leave the program if their regulatory agreement is expired. But two, if you make this tax benefit permanent and actually you augment it, then that will be a substantial inducement for most HDFCs to stay. So we want affordable housing, but we don't want a heavy-handed top-down approach that implements it by fiat. We want an approach that says you have to opt in, just like Mitchell-Lama, just like Article 5 redevelopment companies. You have to affirmatively opt in. Otherwise, you're free to leave. That's the way it works, because after all, we're private property. This is not public housing. Private property means you have the right to dispose of your property. That's how state law works. And so this legislation, in a nutshell, tries to clarify the legal status of HDFCs and reaffirms what we believe is the existing law, which is once your regulatory agreement expires, you can leave. But what we need to do is offer a substantial tax incentive that's permanent so that lenders know that that tax incentive will be there, and that puts us in a position where vis-a-vis other co-ops in the city of New York, which get, and I'll get into this in a little bit, but private co-ops get a substantial tax incentive and they're not even required to be affordable. We're saying we're entitled to at least the tax benefit that these private co-ops get, but more than that, and we want it on a permanent basis. So, so the basic nuts and bolts of this legislation is this two-pronged strategy to secure the future of HDFCs, to stabilize them, but also to make clear that shareholders and the co-ops preserve the right of autonomy and self-determination, and that if you provide enough of a tax incentive, they will stay because they want to be affordable. But if you're going to allow these tax breaks to expire, well, they're going to cash out because they don't have any choice. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to go into greater details, but I wanted to give you all an overview.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think that's a lot of information, and I think maybe we can break it up a little bit. Let's stay on the slide we're on, please. And so I'll just go through some of these slides, which are high level, but which may sort of keep us focused and may also cause us to bring out some more details that may be interesting to everyone. So there are people who out there who are confused about what is the private housing finance law, and is it a state law or is it a city law? So that's what this slide is about. It says that it is a state law. It's the New York State Private Housing Finance Law, or sometimes we call it the PHFL. So the PHFL is a part of New York State law that defines certain types of housing, including HDFC co-op corporations. Most HDFC co-ops, but not all, are incorporated under all HDFC co-ops are incorporated under Article 11 of the Private Housing Finance Law. And most of them, the slide is slightly incorrect, I'm sorry. And most HDFCs, but not all, are also incorporated under the New York State Business Corporation Law, or BCL. Changes to the Private Housing Finance Law could greatly impact you and your HDFC co-op. The city of New York used this law to create HDFC co-ops in the first place. So the city acted as sponsor and created these co-op corporations because they wanted to get rid of thousands of buildings, and over 1,300 buildings the city got rid of by creating HDFC co-ops and selling them to residents. The city also used the Private Housing Finance Law to give most HDFCs a 40-year tax break in 1989. That's the damp tax break that Steve was talking about. It was created in 1989 by the city using the power granted by the state law. And this expires in 2029. Steve, do you have any comments, or can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, the law that governs HDFCs, as John says, the Private Housing Finance Law, was enacted by the state legislature in 1966, a long time ago. And obviously, over 20 years prior to the city of New York creating hundreds of HDFCs during the depths of the fiscal crisis and using this law. But when the legislature enacted the law in the mid-1960s, it had no idea that the city was going to use it for this purpose. And so the law has been kind of tweaked and twisted in terms of how it's been used and applied, but the law is substantially unamended for the last 50 years, which is just one of many reasons why it desperately needs to be amended now to reflect the current realities of the fact that the law was appropriated to be used for hundreds of low-income buildings in a way that the legislature in the 1960s never contemplated. So that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this was from a flyer that we created. I just sort of put these points so we could look at it again. Why change the Private Housing Finance Law that defines HDFCs? So bullet 1, the damp partial tax exemption expires in 2029. It needs to be replaced soon. That's a very key point, and Steve has gone over that. The law was written decades ago and could be updated to clarify the rights of HDFCs. Steve just touched on that. Some elected officials may wish to over-regulate HDFCs when the damp tax break is renewed or replaced with a similar tax break. So I think this point is important because we believe that elected officials do want to renew a tax break for HDFCs. There are a huge number of HDFC buildings and a huge number of HDFC apartments, and so many New Yorkers living in them. I think the city and the state will be in consensus that some sort of tax relief needs to continue beyond 2029. I think the question will be, will we be treated fairly? Will we be respected as the people that save these buildings, or will we be viewed as people that should be run over and over-regulated? And will our property rights on our private homes be abridged to the extent that they're private in name only and essentially public housing? So that's a big part of the battle here. And then the last bullet point here is the HDFC Coalition seeks a permanent tax break for HDFCs that would help all HDFCs, not just ones that are in areas where the real estate has risen, and which creates a higher tax burden for the building, and therefore they get more of the break. To permanently preserve HDFC homes as affordable housing. A renewal of tax forgiveness for distressed HDFCs so that shareholders do not lose their homes and their equity, and to permanently clarify the right of HDFC self-determination. Steve, I think we kind of covered this. Can we go to the next slide?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I'd make a general observation, which is the city's intent to try to preserve affordable housing is an admirable intent. I mean, New York is a very expensive city, and it loses affordable housing every year. And so our mission is to educate officials about what HDFCs are, because HPD is giving a kind of a particular spin on this. Yes, everyone can be in favor of affordable housing, but you have to respect property rights. You can't, I mean, it's really outrageous that the city basically attempted to turn HDFCs into permanent public housing. We're in favor of affordable housing, but the proper way to do it, to balance these competing demands and considerations, is to induce us to remain as affordable housing by offering a tax incentive. Just like, by the way, they do with private developers who, under 80-20 programs where they give private developers huge tax incentives so that 80% are market rate and 20% are subsidized, or they give zoning bonuses. This is part of the city's housing policy, for better or for worse. You offer incentives. You do it for well-placed developers. But here we have low-income people who don't, have lobbyists working for them, and they say, "Oh, let's take a shortcut. Here's an easy way to create permanent affordable housing. We'll just take away people's property rights." And we're saying no, but we're also saying we are in favor of affordable housing, but we want to do it the right way and in an equitable way. And we want to use the device that's used for all developers and also for other types of co-ops like Mitchell Lamas, where if the regulatory agreements are expiring, you then offer a package of incentives to remain in the program and to keep them economically viable. That's all we're asking for.
Okay, thank you. I think I think you've covered the 3 points in here. So could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is, we did an analysis last year. The reason for this analysis was we knew that some HDFCs could qualify. I mean, we're legally able to get the DAMP, and it's a partial tax exemption. It's not a full tax exemption, and it's not an abatement. Steve, you'll agree with me on that? It's a partial tax exemption.
Yeah, I'd be happy to kind of give a little background, because it's a little, it is a little complicated to understand these tax benefits. Maybe we don't need to go into the weeds, but I think it's important to understand that the DAMP tax benefit doesn't actually apply and benefit all HDFCs. And why is that? Because it's a cap. It's not a dollar for dollar reduction in tax liability. It's a cap. If you're paying more than the cap, then it's a ceiling on your liability. But many HDFCs are not paying more than the cap. And if they're not, guess what? They don't get $1 worth of benefit from the existing tax benefit program. And that's why in our legislation, said we want this cap on overall liability, but we want something more that would complement that, so that buildings that don't benefit from an overall cap can instead get a different type of benefit that would actually result in a net reduction in their taxes.
Well, Steve, if you don't mind, if I could simplify that just a bit, right? So I think what maybe we should just simply point out that a building, for example, in the South Bronx, where real estate may not be worth as much as other places, to a buyer, the city would have a lower tax assessment. The city would assign a value to that property that would be less than, let's say, the Lower East Side or the Upper West Side. And even if that building technically would be allowed to get a damp tax break, if the value of the building isn't high enough, they don't even get any benefit from that tax break. So we felt that that was unfair, that a building in an area with lower real estate values should not get a tax break when other HDFCs that are in other areas that have risen in value are not only getting a tax break, but a substantial one. Do you want to go on, Steve?
Yes, I think that you summarized it very well. And so that's our point of departure for saying we want to keep this damp tax exemption in place permanently, but we want to build on it so that every HDFC gets a tax break, not just some. And the way we want to build on it is to say, guess what? Almost every private co-op in the city, other than HDFCs, gets another kind of tax break. We call it the conventional co-op and condo tax abatement. That other type of tax abatement means for buildings that are assessed at $50,000 per unit or less, they get 28% right off the top. 28, they get 1/4 of their taxes sliced off. That's a market rate co-op. That could be conceivably an Upper East Side co-op is getting, now so luxury co-ops can sometimes be subject to a lower rate of 19%, but either 19 or 28% citywide to virtually all co-ops, luxury, middle income, are subject to this other kind of tax break that's called a tax abatement. And we're saying we want our tax exemption under the so-called DAMP, but we also want what every other private co-op. Does it make any sense that an affordable co-op gets less of a tax break than a luxury co-op? It's absolutely irrational. And
Okay, so can you talk about how we did a dual tax break? So where we tried to, basically the proposal calls for the DAMP to be made permanent, and it increases at a lower rate, so it doesn't, so your taxes don't go up as quickly, number one. And number two, for buildings that wouldn't benefit from the DAMP, you suggested taking the co-op condo tax break that luxury co-ops get, or market rate co-ops get, that you just talked about, and taking that tax break and multiplying it by 1.5 or 150%, whatever sounds better, in recognition of the fact that HDFC co-ops are subject to regulation, and they're also providing affordable housing.
Absolutely. And I mean, if a luxury co-op can get either 19 or 28%, and an HDFC, through an anomaly of the law, and by the way, the tax exemption for HDFCs, the DAMP tax, was created in 1989. This co-op and condo tax abatement was enacted, I believe, in 1996. And so it came later, but nobody saw fit to say, well, wait a minute, why are you excluding this class of co-ops that's the most, that furthers public policy, and that makes the most sense that they get a generous tax break. This is upside down, that you wouldn't include that. So literally, the law is written for the co-op and condo tax abatement. As we say, that makes, and as John said, we think we should think more than what a luxury co-op gets. We should be getting 50% more. So the way our draft legislation is written is you should get the greater of the conventional co-op tax abatement. That means that
We're having an issue with
high
Steve's.
income neighborhoods, the damp tax exemption, which is a cap, is very valuable to those buildings because many buildings in those areas are assessed at very high values. And so by having an overall cap or ceiling on tax liability, that's a valuable benefit in a high income neighborhood with high assessment. But as John said, in very low income neighborhoods where the cap is not pierced, then the tax abatement, which is a dollar for dollar tax reduction, would be most valuable to the HDFC. So we
Okay.
think that's the most
Let me
equitable-
interrupt for a second. I have a housekeeping issue. Would people please not put questions or comments in the chat room? Use the Q&A. I'm going through the Q&A. So please put your comments and your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat room. Thank you.
Right, and the Q&A button should be at the bottom of your screen, sort of near the middle. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is what we looked at in terms of over on the left, you'll see approximately what the damp tax rates would be per apartment per year if we stayed at 6%, which is the approximate increase we have now. So basically, if you're paying sort of, I don't know what I call like a full damp, because what I mean is if your taxes are high enough that your damp tax break caps it at the maximum that you would pay with damp. This is basically the price you would pay per apartment per year. But with the existing increase at 6%, it starts to rise up rather quickly. So we propose slowing down that increase. So that's on the right column of that left box. Then in the middle of this slide is the tax rates that Steve was talking about. On the top is the existing co-op condo tax abatement for market rate buildings. This is real. This exists. This is a tax break, which is an abatement, which is money off the tax bill itself that Steve was talking about. So this is real. People, as Steve said, co-ops on Park Avenue can get this. And then below that is what we're proposing is to give HDFCs, if they don't benefit as much from a continuation of the damp tax break, they could instead at least benefit from getting 1.5 times or 150% of the tax abatement that a luxury co-op would get. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? We also added, I live in one of the buildings that actually was able to apply to HPD and get tax forgiveness. There were issues at the building where I now live that stemmed from issues in the 90s because the city sold the building as is with a non-working elevator, all kinds of damage. It's a long story, but in the early 2000s, a tax forgiveness section, which is 577B, was added to the private housing finance law to forgive taxes prior to 2002. You had to apply to HPD. The HDFC Coalition proposes to at least renew that law so that HDFCs with recent tax arrears could apply for tax forgiveness for arrears prior to 2020, because right now the law only allows you to forgive taxes prior to 2002. That's not really going to help anyone anymore. If the bill introduced by Senator Robert Jackson to allow for tax forgiveness for any year gains traction, we would of course support that. So that's another aspect of the proposal that's Steven Siegel helped author and generate for the coalition, which is to renew tax forgiveness for HDFCs. So can we go to the next slide?
Could I just make a general observation that, you know, there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to HDFCs in that, as I'm sure many of you know, there are some that are in very good shape and where the regulatory agreements have expired and are doing well. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are extremely distressed HDFCs. So our proposal tries to address the issues at both ends of the spectrum. Obviously, the best HDFCs, the well-managed ones that have expired regulatory agreements, they might consider going private, and that's a decision they will have to make, that the shareholders will have to make. But at the other end of the spectrum are HDFCs that owe back taxes, back water bills, and who are in no position and are staving off foreclosure. So our proposal tries to address both ends of the spectrum by offering inducements for the best HDFCs to remain in the program and for the most distressed HDFCs to get the subsidies and the benefits that they need to stay afloat, so the city doesn't take title to them, which is in no one's interest.
Right. Steve, before we get to this slide, if we could actually back up one slide here. Is that possible? No, go backwards, please. Can we go backwards? In any case, while that's going on. So Steve, we talked about the tax break that we proposed for the draft legislation. At the same time, can we go backwards? At the same time, just like the existing co-op condo tax break has a requirement of primary. Okay, that's perfect. Well, okay. We could just stay on the screen with all the numbers, the spreadsheet. Thank you. So Steve, one of the things we didn't get to was this. In general, the city and the state want something. They want some sort of a commitment to affordability in order to give very generous tax breaks to buildings that call themselves affordable housing. And the city wanted extreme measures. They essentially wanted to take control of our buildings, and they wanted to lower the AMI levels, which is area median income. That's the income restriction on the buyer, not on the price of the apartment, but the buyer. They wanted to lower that from what they had published, what the HPD had published for years, which was 165% of AMI. They wanted to lower that to approximately 100% or 110% or something like that. And there were all sorts of other restrictions. And so I know that there were many discussions and you struggle with the idea of, there has to be some sort of give and take. And at one point, you used the term regulatory agreement, but you weren't referring to what the city has been trying to get people to sign. And there were objections to that. So that language was taken out, and even though that was never your intention, that language was taken out. And can you describe the mechanism that you have in this current proposal? With this proposal, what would HDFCs be required to adhere to in order to get these generous tax breaks? And I think what we're talking about is the AMI level and simply a statement, an annual statement notifying the city if any apartments had been sold and that kind of thing.
Okay. Because we are requesting a substantial tax benefit, then there has to be some degree of oversight. And this is where, the rubber hits the road, because obviously people are very sensitive to this point. Yes, as John said, in an earlier draft, we had the term regulatory agreement to describe the agreement to get the tax benefit. But upon further consideration, we decided that term, even if we define it very narrowly, is a problem because HPD might try to piggyback stuff on top of it. No matter how we drafted the legislation to narrow it, that the better way, and that's what's reflected in the current draft, is to say that simply by operation of law, if the co-op, if the HDFC agrees to these tax benefits, there is no agreement with the city at all. It just is, it is just imposed and is a benefit that's available to the co-op.
So
Now-
you're saying that, so if you, I'm sorry to interrupt, but basically am I correct that you're pointing out that if this legislation that you propose would be passed, HDFCs would automatically have a tax break? Is that correct?
Correct. And now what we're talking about is the class of HDFCs that used to be subject to regulatory controls, and those controls have expired. And so they're in this sort of limbo in which, as most of you know, the private housing finance law says that housing must be low income. But if you're not subject to a regulatory agreement, then HPD is not really the enforcement agency because they have to be in an agreement in order to enforce it. The latest iteration of our proposed legislation says simply, if you have an expired regulatory agreement and you accept these tax benefits, there is a requirement. There is an affirmative obligation. HDFC, there has to be. I mean, you can't just get free money and not have to do anything for it. So what we've designed is a very minimalist obligation, but I think it's credible. I think it gives credibility to what we're proposing because we want to show that we mean what we say. And so what we're proposing is simply this, that every year, the HDFC has to send a one-page statement to HPD, the supervisory agency, in return for getting the tax benefit that says the following apartments have turned over in the last year and that they meet the income requirements of the incoming shareholder, that the HDFC board has reviewed documents and are satisfied that the incoming shareholder satisfies the income requirement.
Okay, Steve, I'm sorry, let me interrupt. So, but just to be clear, this is not a requirement where the HDFC would have to send information about every shareholder every year. For example, if there was a year where there were no sales, then the HDFC would simply say there were no sales. If the next year there was one sale, then the HDFC would say there was one sale, and then that sale met the requirements of the law. And I think the law that you're proposing would simply be that the income of the purchasing shareholder was no greater than 165% of AMI. Is that correct?
Actually, the way the legislation is written is either 165% of the AMI,
Right.
or the formula used in the private housing finance law, which is that 6 times the annual maintenance fee plus utilities.
Right.
Yeah. So
Okay. So my apologies.
You get
So
to select either of those two.
right.
Those
So
are the
okay, but let me
accepted
point out. I'm sorry. So let me point out that the HDFC would have a choice to either certify, if there was, let's say again, if there was no sales, there's nothing to report. If there was a sale, then the HDFC would report that sale, and the HDFC would certify that the new shareholder who purchased either met the requirement of not exceeding 165% AMI, area median income, or the HDFC could also use the existing formula, which has been been on the books for decades. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I want to emphasize again, we want to put forward credible legislation. We want minimalist regulation. We don't want a heavy hand, but I think we came up with a mechanism here which is reasonable And I think that most HDFCs can understand the reason that if you are receiving a large tax benefit, you have to do something in return, but not be pervasively regulated by HBD, but certify as to affordability requirements, which, as John said, would consist only of identifying the apartments that turned over and certifying that the people who moved in met the income requirements.
Okay. And
By the
I'm
way,
sure there are going to be questions.
also, did I
What?
just finish?
Go ahead.
There's an exemption for if you transfer your apartment to relatives, members of your family, then that certification does not apply. That we want to preserve the ability of people to pass down their home to members of their immediate family without having to certify as to the income requirements.
Okay, thank you. So I think maybe we could, and let me just ask a question here. So some people may be wondering if this legislation was passed, which HDFCs would it apply to? Would it only apply, would this tax break only be available to HDFCs that have expired restrictions, such as their original, their deed restrictions have expired many years ago, or maybe they had a regulatory agreement and it expired? So would it only apply to HDFCs with expired restrictions, or would it also apply to HDFCs that have a current regulatory agreement with a housing agency like HPD?
Well, as you could probably guess, yes, we're writing into the law the right of all HDFCs to receive this tax benefit on a across the board basis. Now the major issue has been the gray area caused by HDFCs with expired regulatory agreements. So our focus is on kind of filling that gray area, but all HDFCs in whatever status, whether they've just entered into a regulatory agreement with the city, whether they've gotten mortgage financing from the city, that recently had their title transfer from the city, whatever it is, yes, I mean that because under current law, the city only is allowed to give one 40-year tax exemption to any one building, and when that's up, they don't have any authority to give a renewal tax benefit, unless the building were to say to reincorporate. But for any one incorporated building under existing law, that building is entitled to one and only one 40-year tax benefit. So we're making that permanent, and we're doing it across the board.
Okay, and I think this is another, thank you. And I think this is another time to ask a question so that everyone can hear, because this comes up all the time. So people say, well, hey, everybody talks about the fact that HPD's oversight, the restriction period for all these HDFCs have expired. So why can't we just become a regular co-op? Why can't we, quote unquote, leave the program? Why can't we dissolve our corporation and reincorporate as a normal co-op? And would you mind just speaking to that? And also, when you do, could you please mention the state attorney general's opinion on that you believe very much clouded this issue?
All right, well, that's a complicated area of the law.
Well, maybe there's a short answer. I don't know.
Well, yes. I mean, I think we touched on this before. It's our view that once these regulatory agreements expire, there's nothing in the law to prevent HDFCs from reincorporating as a private co-op, and the HDD commissioner has no right to prevent that from happening. Understand that under New York law generally, any corporation can dissolve itself at any time. That's just inherent in the law. And the business corporation law says, yes, you can dissolve a corporation. A corporation is of an infinite life, but it can end at any time. And there's nothing in the private housing finance law that says absent a regulatory agreement with the Commission of HPD, you still can't dissolve the corporation and reincorporate. There, that's our strong view. There is a convoluted opinion of an attorney general, and I don't really want to get into it, but we've analyzed that. That takes a somewhat different view. But suffice it to say that the best evidence that we're right and the attorney general is wrong is that the city of New York, in sponsoring legislation, I mentioned this early on, acknowledges that if we don't have legislation that makes HDFC status permanent, we will lose these HDFCs because they can leave. That's the city talking. And they would know because they are the agency in charge of regulating this. So the law is a mess, no question about it. And the problem is that it's not been tested in the courts. Why? Probably because for the most part, HDFCs don't have enough money to hire lawyers and not only get this litigated, but then go up on appeal to get a precedential decision by the New York Appellate Division that will clearly state, because that's what courts are supposed to do. That is, when you have confusing and ambiguous law, the courts are supposed to clean up the mess and say, this is clearly what the legislature intended, but we have no precedential case. We don't have enough money to litigate that and bring it up on appeal to get a definitive court ruling on the status of the private housing finance law for unregulated HDFCs. But having said that, I emphasize again that the city itself, in sponsoring legislation with the state legislature, says we desperately need this legislation. Why? Because we're going to lose HDFCs who have expired regulatory agreements. So they said that. We didn't say that.
Okay. Steve, if you don't mind, could we, because I know people might get confused with this. They might think we're talking about a brand new bill. They might think we're talking about a bill introduced or drafted by
17.
Right. So this, to be clear, this was a bill that was drafted by the mayor's office, I think in approximately 2017, and the mayor's office gave it to State Senator Betty Little, who at that time was the chair of the Housing Committee in Albany, and it was introduced, and the HDFC coalition put the word out, and a lot of committed HDFC shareholders made phone calls and wrote letters, and the bill was killed. And so this two things here. So I want to clarify, this is a bill that's dead, number one, and I want to clarify, just want to highlight that political action by HDFC shareholders does work. So if you ever get these emails from us and say, is this a waste of time? It's not. And I also want to point out that the battle we're talking about now, which is to push forward our own version of what the law should be, will be the biggest battle of all and will require the most work and the most commitment. All right, could we go back to further down in the slides to sort of where we were before, please? I think where we last left off, we went past this one, please. Yes, so this is kind of where we were. We kind of talked about this. HDFCs and the right of self-determination. So this is what Steve has been talking about, which is not to say that we're trying to get HDFCs to reincorporate as normal co-ops. Is not what our agenda is. Our agenda is maintaining our rights. That's what we're trying to do. It says, so what's written here is, it says most HDFC co-ops were never designed to be permanently regulated by the city. The documents created by the city itself made this clear. However, most HDFCs are still HDFCs. This is because, number one, the overwhelming majority of HDFCs need to remain as affordable housing with low tax rates, and two, the private housing finance law isn't perfectly
We probably
clear.
covered this, John.
Okay, all right. And then okay, the city tried to get Albany to change the private housing finance law. to put all HDFC co-ops under permanent control. We just talked about that, but HDFC shareholders raised their voices and killed the bill. And then more recently, a draft bill by the Lower East Side Assembly member Harvey Epstein attempted to do something similar, but due to shareholder opposition, it was never introduced. So we still get a lot of questions about that. People ask what's going on with that bill. It was a draft bill. It was never introduced. It still has not been introduced. But he still has an ombudsman bill that was introduced. All right, so can we go to the next slide, please? Most HDFCs co-ops by far want and need to remain as HDFCs. We're not advocating that any HDFC dissolve or incorporate. We went over that. Further, we believe that if our buildings are put under permanent regulation by the city, we would lose control of our privately owned homes and our buildings would essentially become public housing. Therefore, we want to, 1, retain our legal rights and our right of self-determination, and 2, ensure a permanent tax break for HDFCs, for all HDFCs, so that HDFC co-ops will always want to remain as affordable housing for their shareholders. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the Q&A, and I think we may want to turn it over to, oh, I just got a pop-up that says English and Spanish interpretation available. So let's not miss this. I just saw a little bubble pop up on my screen. This is English and Spanish interpretation available. So
is this is April. Is Signe on the line, or Chris, the interpreter? Can you either of you speak and let us know how people can access that?
Well, there's a button that looks like a globe that says interpretation or interpretación. If that's how you say it. So that might be the thing.
Okay, John, why don't you keep going, and I'm sending a text.
Okay.
Access.
All right. So first, I will go over. I will look. There were a couple questions that came in.
Why don't you let me feed the questions to you, because I've been reviewing them. All right.
Oh, well, I got a couple that came in by email before the.
Okay. Okay.
All right. So number 1 is Harvey Epstein still trying to get New York State Assembly Bill A9608 passed to change HDFC housing regulations. I forgot the number of A9608. If that's the introduced one, there's 2 he had introduced. One was an ombudsman bill. I'm not sure that has any co-sponsors. And the other bill is a bill that he had with Senator Robert Jackson. And I spoke about that earlier. That is a very similar bill to a portion of Steve's legislation, which is to renew tax forgiveness for HDFCs. The one we were, I would say, most worried about, it was never introduced. Another question is, I was told that this is not really pertain to this topic.
John, let me just explain
Okay.
something for people who may not understand the process. So even if a bill is introduced and the ombudsman's bill was introduced, once the session ends, all of the bills that were introduced that year get canceled out if they haven't gone through committee and in some manner in the process, and they have to either get tabled or scuttled and reintroduced the following year, or they get recrafted and reintroduced the following year, which is why we're putting together our bill, because we want our bill to be the lead bill that gets introduced at the next Assembly and Senate session.
April, this is Signe. I just want you to know that Kika re-signed in and there is Spanish room now if anybody wants it.
So do people just click on the button?
Do you see the interpretation button now at the bottom?
Yeah.
They just go into the Spanish go in that room and she'll be translating.
Okay, so for everyone's information, if you need Spanish interpretation, you can just click on the globe ball that is next to the Q&A, and Kika is in the room waiting for you. Sorry for the delay. And I actually saw Blanca somewhere. Can Blanca be unmuted so she can say that in Spanish for people? Or Michael? Going once, going twice. Okay, go continue, John.
Okay, there was another question that came in. I'm just gonna run by this because this doesn't really pertain to the topic, but it's good for another webinar. I was told that NYC has funds to help HDFCs make repairs and renovations. Could you assist me with finding out if that is true? I think that you sometimes can get loans through HPD, but they're gonna throw a regulatory agreement on the table and force you to sign it if you want that sort of assistance. That's really for another webinar, I think. Another question from John Mazias, asking about excessive fines for local 11. We need to reduce or get amnesty. I think that's a very important topic, but that's for another webinar. And that's what I have. So April, why don't you take it from here then?
I keep muting myself so that you don't hear.
So April, if you want to pitch.
Yep, I'm just
Yep.
scrolling
Okay.
through the questions, so
Okay.
bear with me for 1 second. Okay, so this is kind of topical. Someone said that Jules Kleinman said this is an admirable goal to protect our private housing ownership, but keep in mind that New York City and New York State are on the verge of or already in a fiscal crisis, if not bankruptcy, nearing. And do we seriously think that politicians will carry this as an issue? The more well-off constituents and use us as piggy banks to bail them out.
I don't know, April, do you want to take
Start
that?
up with the, well, I think that that might be the inclination, but the fact that particularly in New York City, we are over 30,000 units strong, and we have in other fights been able to come together and get our points across in a cohesive manner. And I think that we are presenting here sensible legislation, not, what is being presented by the other side is basically a takeover of our buildings, if not immediately, then into the future. And we, as shareholders, homeowners, residents, community residents, we don't think that that is what we signed up for in the beginning. And I think that if we are united and educated and we organize the other constituents, we will have enough of the powerful voices in the state Senate and the Assembly who would be with us to push forth this legislation, because one, they see the value of community ownership and control, and two, they see the value of people of color having a stake in their communities, which is what HDFCs basically are. And they also understand the history of HDFCs and the development of our community. And the people who live in HDFCs are not the developers who are just here looking for a buck, or people who are trying to flip apartments, but people who actually want to live in and invest in communities and who vote for them or don't vote for them. So I think that, with an organized effort, we can get the legislation passed. And the fact is that New York City is in a fiscal crisis, but we still have an $88 billion budget, and the state has a whole hell of a lot more. So it's not that there isn't money, it's where the money is going to be spent. And we are, even though we're a small part, we're an important part of communities. And so we've got to have some of the attention and the dollars spent in our direction.
I think if you don't mind, I think I would also add that I don't think elected officials want, another crisis on their hands. And I think there would be a crisis if the tax break for HDFCs, which applies to approximately 30,000 apartments, as you said, which is approximately 90,000 people, would have suddenly evaporate. That would be a crisis for the city. So I think they do want to renew the tax break. The question is, to me, in my mind, is what that's going to look like.
I would add that there are many different ways this can be spun, but one way is the preservation of affordable housing, which I think is pretty high up on the kind of the totem pole of political priorities. If I think it's a fair description of this legislation to call it as being about the preservation of affordable housing, of this unique housing stock, to secure its future. Because right now, as we said before, some of these buildings are not going to be able to get loans because of the scheduled expiration of tax benefits in 2029. We need to focus on this now, and I think everybody across the political spectrum agrees that we need legislation on HDFCs. You know, everyone from Harvey to you can agree to disagree on the approach, but everyone agrees that there needs to be legislation because the current law is a mess and the issues and ambiguities have to be cleaned up, and we need to secure the damn tax exemption now and in the future. Everybody agrees on that. What we disagree on is the method and the approach. And we think our approach is the best, and that respects the property rights of HDFC homeowners, but also effectively says, you know, since they do have the right to leave, like every other private housing finance law co-op, we want them to stay, and here's how you do it. And if you do it this way, you promote affordable housing.
Okay, so there are a couple of requests for a concise, plain English summary of what we have discussed tonight and the proposals that we're presenting. And we have various documents posted on the HDFC Coalition website, hdfccoalition.org. But we will try to drill it down even a little bit more and make it more plain English.
I can't, you're breaking up. It's hard for me to hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think it's because
Oh, that's a little
one of
better.
the reasons I have my video off is because my audio is such a mess. Let me see if I talk directly into the mic.
That's better.
That's my.
All right. So we will work on something that's a little more plain English to have available for people who are in the webinar, as well as people who you'd like to pass the information along to. And we hope to have something of that sort in the next couple of weeks that we can distribute.
Yes.
But we will distribute the recording before that, hopefully by the end of this week. And then just there's a short question that asks, is it true that not all HDFCs are co-op? Yes, Virginia, it's true. There are HDFC rentals also, and those are generally owned by private owners or not-for-profits. Okay, I'm just scrolling through. Do elected officials know about HDFCs? How much do they know about HDFCs? How much they know varies. And there is quite a bit of misinformation about HDFCs. Many think that we're the same as Mitchell-Lamas. Many think that we're the same as community land trusts. We are not. And part of what we have been doing for the last several years is trying to educate elected officials about HDFCs. And next year and following next year, we will have a big job because a large majority of the city council will turn over. We will have a new mayor, and we will have the job of educating those newly elected officials about HDFCs that are either in their community or not in their community. And there are some elected officials that are very well steeped in what HDFCs are, but we've got a job ahead of us. And we also have the job of keeping HDFCs front and center. So, you know, some of the elected officials know about HDFCs, have them in their district, but with so many pressing issues, we fall to the wayside. So our job is to keep front and center.
April, can I bring up this question here? We could give to
Yep.
Steve. It says, Steve, would you please provide the city statute that forbids the city from renewing a tax benefit after 40 years. So I think that is not the city statute, it's the city's use of the state statute. Steve, do you want to take that?
It's Private Housing Finance Law 577, which is the state authorization for tax benefits to HDFCs. And it references the 40 years in the text of the statute. And that's why in 1989, the city's then governing body, the Board of Estimate, which no longer exists, granted 40-year tax benefits to all extant HDFCs that existed at the time. And I guess as new HDFCs are created, the city grants them 40-year tax benefits consistent with Section 577.
So Steve, would you agree that because of this, the solution would be to either, as we're doing, create a brand new tax break for HDFCs by amending the private housing finance law, or conversely, I mean, not that we're suggesting this, but another way that might work would be for the private housing finance law to be amended to take away that limitation, that 140-year period.
Well, our law, our proposed legislation is making the tax benefit that we are proposing permanent.
Right.
It's doing away with the temporal limitation on it.
Right. I'm saying we would have to do either one of those two things or something else, is what I'm trying to say. Something would have to be done with the state law if we're going to give a tax break to HDFCs, you know, in this manner.
Right. Under existing law, the city is limited to a 40-year grant of tax benefit to any one building, any one HDFC building. That's what the current law is. Our law would remove that temporal limitation.
April, do you have another question, or
Yep.
do you want me to grab one?
So what, I think you all covered this, but it just came up again. So maybe you could just, what would happen with HDFCs that currently owe tax money? Would they be included in the new legislation? Like if they're in arrears?
Yeah, there's nothing in the legislation that disqualifies a HDFC merely because they're in arrears. Yeah, I mean, that section that we went over for distressed HDFCs who may qualify for additional tax assistance over and above the as of right benefit that we're offering. But that's, so I know this is complicated, but so we were offering two sets of tax benefits, an as of right tax benefit available to all HDFCs, and then for distressed HDFCs who are in danger of foreclosure, they have the right to apply, and the city can decide to grant them relief under the state law to basically wipe away the arrears. But right, but that's a separate issue from our as of right tax benefit, regardless of the financial status of the HDFC.
Okay. Another question is, does this apply to HDFCs that were created by NYCHA?
NYCHA.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that question because I know at least in Harlem, there is a development, and this is Zaya Zafra. There was a development where NYCHA residents were given the opportunity to purchase co-ops in a specific HDFC, and that HDFC is not owned by NYCHA, so NYCHA has no connection to it. So if that's what you're talking about, the Madison Avenue development, then NYCHA has no connection, and yes, you would be under this same rubric if this proposed legislation were passed. And any HDFC co-op would be under the rubric of this proposed legislation should it pass.
Correct. The vast majority of HDFCs are created by the city of New York, but that's just how it happened. But there's nothing in the HDFC statute that requires that the city of New York create HDFCs as opposed to any other entity. But it just so happens historically, most HDFCs were created by the city of New York, taking an in-rem building and then acting as the sponsor for the co-op offering plan, so that the city is the seller. And I assume that with the NYCHA was the seller, just like the city was the seller, and the co-op was the buyer. But yes, this, as April says, our proposal applies across the board to all HDFCs that are incorporated under Article 11 of the Private Housing Finance Law, which is the HDFC statute.
And so there's a question about third-party transfer buildings. Third-party transfer buildings, if they have gone through the entire process and are owned by another entity, would not, if, you know, because sometimes they're rentals, they were co-ops, they were turned into third part, they went through the TPT program and become rentals. If they go through the TPT program and then are reconstituted as HDFC co-ops, yes, this proposal would be applicable to them. But if they're privately owned rentals, either by a nonprofit or a for-profit, it would not be applicable to them. Okay, some of these questions are redundant. So if people have other questions that they want to ask, and some of them are pretty specific, so I'm not going to ask those for the general population.
April, do you mind if I ask Steve a question that comes up a lot while you try to find?
Yep.
So Steve, a lot of people are, I think, confused about the nature of HDFC co-ops from the beginning. In general, I would say. I mean, the city was the sponsor and therefore created so many HDFC co-ops. And there was actually a program called the TIL program, which was tenant interim lease, which was sort of the pathway for tenants to form a tenant association. And if they sort of managed to do that, then become, end up as owners of the co-op, which was an HDFC. But I think a lot of people are surprised when they find out that the type of corporation, HDFC, Housing Development Fund Corporation, which was created as a section in the Private Housing Finance Law. I think most people are surprised to learn that this part of the law was not designed to do what the city later did with it. That this law was written before the fiscal crisis in New York City of the 1970s, before there was before landlords abandoned or torched or walked away from over 10,000 buildings, and the city had to take these on and then immediately had to find a way to get rid of them. So would you mind just whatever comes to your mind about that, where just the idea that the city was looking for a way to get rid of these buildings, and the HDFC form of corporation may not have been the perfect thing, but they used it. It wasn't really designed for this, but they used it anyway. And the fact that the city made clear that this was there was a temporary restriction period, because the city probably didn't want to have anything to do with these buildings, 15 years later or what have you. And now the city has changed its tune and said, oh, no, the intention was we would control your buildings forever. Can you sort of speak to something along those lines?
Okay, well, I think we covered some of this ground. Yeah, I mean, the documents that the city itself created in connection with the co-op offering plans speak for themselves. If you look through your certificate of incorporation, if you look through, the deed and the other documents there, the city used this procedural vehicle of the Private Housing Finance Law and then entered into some documents with fixed terms with what the building could do or not do with the permission of the Commissioner of HPD. So, I mean, from an equitable standpoint, shareholders bought their apartments, they read their documents, they consulted attorneys or talked among themselves. It looked pretty clear. but nobody really thought through what would happen at the end. City was, as John says, was disposing of a lot of properties, continues to use this. But, you know, if the question is, there are documents, and this is something that, you know, state legislators would be interested in, that, look, here it says right here in black and white that there are restrictions and they expire. And that's what the private housing finance law itself says. It says, for so long as you're subject to a regulatory agreement, the HPD commissioner can do certain things. But once that agreement expires at the end of a fixed term, the HPD commissioner is deprived of power to do those things. Now, one thing I should add is that because the buildings receive a tax benefit, there's probably, obviously, you're not going to be able to get out from under unless you stop receiving the tax benefit. So even if you have an expired regulatory agreement, but you're receiving the tax benefit, then you're not going to be able to go private or opt out unless you give up the tax benefit. That sort of states the obvious. But the ability of the commissioner to regulate the building, if there's no regulatory agreement, and if you give up the tax benefit, again, that's, I think the law is clear that then the HPD commissioner loses his or her authority over the building. And that's what we're saying. And that's why, because the vast majority of HDFCs today have expired agreements. So nobody knows in this twilight zone what they can do and what they can't do, because again, no one has tested this in litigation. So again, we're trying to step into the breach and say we need legislation to clarify the rights and obligations of these HDFCs. And we're saying if you give them a reason to stay and offer them good benefits, they're gonna stay, but you have to respect their property rights as well.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So here's another question. How much that I don't think can be answered, but through or go briefly through a couple of examples on the chart that explains the taxes. How much could HDFC taxes plausibly rise if the tax exemption is expired? And I will parenthetically add, or if a building opts out. Would you recommend that HDFC start taking action to expand their long-term reserves? I would say it's never a bad idea to expand your long-term reserves, tax exemption, expiration or not. But what I would recommend is that HDFC shareholders become informed and pay attention to this, because you don't want it to come down upon you either way, and you are, suddenly surprised about it. So, help us get other people educated. But how much would taxes plausibly rise? I don't think that's a question that you're going to walk away with an answer for your building. But John, maybe you could go over one of the examples on the tax chart to just show what it might be in a particular scenario.
Well, I mean, frankly, anyone can get that answer by just looking at their tax bill, because your tax bill, if you're getting the damp tax break, your tax bill will show you what your taxes would have been and how much the damp tax break is saving you. So you should be able to look online, go to the New York City Department of Finance website, which is sometimes DOF, Department of Finance, DOF, and you should be able to look up your tax bill. I can't remember if you're required to put in your block and lot. If you don't know what your block and lot is, you can Google that. But basically every block in the city has a number, and every piece of land on every block is called a lot and has a number as well. But you may be able to just find it by putting in your address.
Yeah, well, and just to expound on that, the point of the damp tax exemption is if there's no fixed amount for every building, it varies precisely because it's not a dollar for dollar reduction. It's a cap or a ceiling on what you can pay. So that is, if you're assessed way over the cap, then you have a big benefit. If you're assessed at around the cap, then it's a small benefit. If you're assessed below the cap, there's no benefit. So the answer is, it depends on what your assessment is.
Okay, two questions. One is, how would the new legislation affect an HDFC whose regulatory agreement has expired? If your regulatory agreement has expired and you are still getting the damp tax partial tax exemption, you would still get the partial tax exemption. The two are not linked. What the city's proposal prior and what the legislation that the assemblyman was proposing would have linked the two. We are trying to in a positive manner where the tax exemption would be permanent and you would not to sign a regulatory agreement. So if your regulatory agreement is expired, you wouldn't have or to get a tax benefit. And the next question is, I hope that was clear. Where can you go to find out if your regulatory agreement has expired? You would have to go to your building's documents or be able to look on a city website, ACRIS. And you may find it in the mortgage documents, but the best way is that if you do not have a copy of all of your building's documents, you can request to look at them from your boards of directors, and the regulatory agreement would be included in that package of documents if your building has one. Not every building has a regulatory agreement, so you may not have a regulatory things. Let me just clarify while I'm talking, is that some people mistake a regulatory agreement for the terms of your original proprietary lease, which said that you had income restrictions for a period of years. That those two things are very.
April, we lost you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back now.
So what I said is that some people think that a regulatory agreement is the same thing as the original income restrictions that were written into your original offering plan. They are two different things. And I'm going to ask Steve if he would briefly describe what the income limits are in the documents, the original proprietary lease, and what's the difference between a regulatory agreement. They're not the same.
Okay. Well, it's confusing. The term regulatory agreement is in the private housing finance law statute. And it's the magic words that are used to allow the supervisory agency, in this case, HPD, to regulate the building. But in the first 20 years of the HDFC program, HPD did supervise the building, but they didn't use the magic word regulatory agreement. They did it through contractual documents that weren't titled regulatory agreement, but had the same effect as a regulatory agreement. They put it into the certificate of incorporation, into the deed, and in those documents, it had the same practical effect as a regulatory agreement with regard to the ability of HPD to impose limitations on the management of the building, but it wasn't called the term regulatory agreement. Sometime in the late 1990s, the city actually started using a document for new HDFCs called regulatory agreements. And if you enter into a loan with the city, then you definitely will get a regulatory agreement. So this is all very confusing. But so when we use the term regulatory agreement, what we mean is the bundle of restrictions either that are titled a regulatory agreement or titled under some other kind of document that the building entered into that has the effect of imposing the supervisory authority of HPD over the building. And in all cases, that's time limited. That's the most important point, is that they were time limited. And whenever these contractual documents, whether they're called regulatory agreements or something else, expires, that's when the city's ability to do the things that are contained in the documents also expire. So now, having said that, I mentioned this before, obviously for buildings with expired regulatory agreements, they are receiving the damp tax benefit. So that's not a regulatory agreement, but they are receiving a governmental assistance, which gives HPD some authority over them. The question is, what happens if you don't receive the damp tax exemption and you're not subject to a regulatory agreement? Well, in that case, you're free to go. If you repudiate the damp and you're not subject to a regulatory agreement, then you can opt out if that's what you want to do. That's what our point is. So I hope I answered that, but it is a confusing question.
I think you did, Steve, but I think that you may have inadvertently left the impression that anyone can easily leave, quote unquote, leave the program with your last.
Yeah, you can't just say oh, we looked and the date of our income limits expired. We can just go do whatever we want. It's not that simple. And we would probably recommend that you have some attorney review your documents, and you'd have to speak with HPD, and there's a whole process that you got to go through that we're not going to review tonight, but we may in a later seminar. Okay, so I'm just looking through the questions. I think we have magically answered all the questions if I have not. So I'm just going to recap some of the things that came up. One is, okay, I will give that information, Glory. One is that we need a more plain language interpretation of what we are trying to put across. So we will come up with that. We will send out the slide presentation, the recording, and the survey for feedback. If you have not signed up for the HDFC Coalition mailing list, the website, can we go to that slide with the HDFC Coalition website, please? Is hdfccoalition.org. You can sign up for the mailing list and you'll get all of our e-blasts. You can look through, there's a ton of information on the website. You will be able to also give us a small donation or a large donation should you like to. And also, and in the and out a report of the money that has been spent. And as I say, it's only been spent on postage, mailings. And so I got it from Gloria.
April, you're breaking up again.
Oh, I'm sorry. I bet you heard that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I hope you didn't hear that.
I didn't.
Explicative. We have the HDFC Coalition also has an anti-foreclosure committee, and they do a lot of good work to help buildings that are in immediate distress, either because of pending foreclosure or high debt. And you can contact Glory, GLORYNY at AOL.com. Get in touch with her and she can give you a ton of information and help your buildings in that regard. And we also plan to do in a later seminar something specific about buildings that are in distress pending foreclosure, but not buildings that are just in distress, because there are a lot of buildings because of COVID and people losing their jobs, not successfully renting out their commercial space or losing their commercial tenants. that are in distress now. And so we plan to, at one of our upcoming seminars, to focus on just buildings that are in distress. Okay, and the email is for Glory Kirsten, Glory, GLORYNY at AOL. And it's posted in the Q&A if you want to look for it. Thanks. And thanks, Glory. All right. So do we have any other last questions? Please type them in now, or we will do our closing. Or any final comments from the presenters?
I just want to thank Steve for doing such a fabulous job. Steve has been really such a key player and having the legal firepower and analysis behind us, because we've needed a legal analysis to help us win a lot of our fights. We won the fight against the city's attempt to have every HDFC in town sign a regulatory agreement in 2016. We fought back against what some people call the Betty Little bill, which was the mayor's attempt to have the private housing finance law changed so that all HDFC co-ops would be essentially permanent public housing. And Steve was also extremely helpful in helping draft legislation that Councilmember Mark Levine got passed very recently. And that what that did was it exempted us from Local Law 64, which would have forced everybody who owned an HDFC co-op apartment to list their apartment on an HPD website, the housing portal, every year. And if you didn't do it, you could be fined up to $2,000 per month per apartment. So that was a huge win. And Steve helped us with the analysis for that. And so can't thank you enough.
Thank you, John.
Okay.
Thank you. And,
Yeah.
and I want to return the compliment by saying I've been honored to work with you guys for 3 years. You're the best. And this is what grassroots democracy is all about. We don't have paid lobbyists. We are organized so that if we provide excellent advocacy, and we're a bottom-up organization that gets our credibility because we know we can bring people out, if necessary, to the streets. Politicians know that. And so I've seen this. It's been fascinating to see this from the inside, to see how, all your civics textbooks in high school about how democracy is supposed to work, but oftentimes rarely seems to work that way. We've been able to counteract, forces way, way beyond our pay grade. But because the policy committee is so dedicated and is so politically sophisticated, that it's been a great experience to work with you all.
Thank
I
you.
will thank you both Steve and John, and thank the members of the policy committee, Tina DeFelici Antonio, Peter Green, Sylvia Tyler, Michael Palma, and the other attorneys who work with us also, Emma Lupa and Andrew Stern. And yeah, we have done some pretty incredible work, but we've got a lot of work ahead of us, and we're not the lot to rest on our laurels. And we also want to thank all of you amazing HDFC shareholders who rise to the challenge, come when you're called. And we know we're fighting for our homes and we're fighting for our communities, and it couldn't be more important for us and our children and our grandchildren. And also let us thank the anti-foreclosure committee and all of those guys, Glory at the helm, who have done amazing work saving buildings that were on the brink of privatization in the wrong hands. And last but not least, let me thank penultimate, let me thank Christine, the interpreter who shows up every meeting and helps us out. So making sure that our information is accessible to everyone. And last, let me thank the community board, my community board, Community Board 9 of Manhattan, where the HDFC Coalition started way back when. And the community board who's always there willing to help us to put these events together. And the chair, Barry Weinberg, the district manager, youth staff, who tonight is Ray Macklin. We thank all of you. And most importantly, we thank all of you shareholders who continue to show up and who fight so hard and have our backs and are there in front of us when you need to lead. So we, thank you all. And please, 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 when you get the survey, read the legislation and give us your comments, and don't hold back, and also give us suggestions for webinars that you would like to see going forward, because we hope to have one each month just to keep together and to keep the information flowing. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay,
Good night.
good night. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Signe, who's behind the scenes, but she's always there helping us. She's the co-chair of our Housing, Land Use, and Zoning Committee at Community Board 9.
If I'm doing it right, you forget about me. I'm in the background.
Couldn't live without you, Signe.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.